Okay, today's video is going to be about 3D printing a replacement trigger guard for a Ruger American rifle. Now, the Ruger Americans have a one-piece stock and trigger guard, and if you break this off, you have to buy the whole new stock. So with a 3D printer, you can print a new one and bolt it in place if you know what you're doing. So this video is about the process of designing and replacing this trigger guard. You'll see there's one bolt missing. We still got to go to Ace Hardware and buy a replacement bolt for that, because the original bolt starts about here and goes into the receiver. And well, I'll show you the rest. So here are all three versions of this trigger guard. One, it has full support in the middle, which just seemed to get in the way. So I'll cut that out to try it out. But this bottom one has a shorter trigger guard. So I like the height of that one. So on the third version, I cut that completely out, 3D printed a nice fit to the original frame, and shortened it. So let's see how this fits. Nice. So I've got a friend who has a Ruger American rifle in 300 Blackout, and on a really cold day, he snapped the trigger guard off, and because the trigger guard is built into the stock, there's no way to replace that factory-wise unless you buy a whole new stock. So I have taken the measurements on his rifle and am making a new trigger guard on my 3D printer. So we're basically just going to cut the old remaining parts of the trigger guard off, sand it smooth, and put in a new guard. So this is a first print after I've designed it. Let's see how this works out. We're also printing a small cube, about 20 by 20 by 15 millimeters, to place inside the stock. There's a square cavity there, so we can insert a nut into it so we can tighten down the rear part of the trigger guard. There's nothing to screw to back there, and the stock is actually too thin for threads or anything. There's a screw for the receiver to mount to the stock in front of the trigger guard, and it goes down into the stock a little ways and tightens the screw. So what we're going to use, we're going to reuse that hole and mount the trigger guard with it, but we're going to fill that hole in with the 3D printer and tap a new hole for a longer bolt to go down. That's what this piece is sticking out here in the front. So that's basically going to go down the old hole in the stock. This is the design in Tinkercad, real simple online design software. Sometimes I use FreeCAD and other things like Fusion 360, but this one's easy enough to do in Tinkercad. So here's that block I was talking about. We're going to set inside the frame, or inside the stock. I'm going to put a nut in that hole so we can run a bolt here to tighten up against in the back. And on that front cavity, basically, we're going to print to fill that hole, and then get a longer bolt from the store to put down through here to tighten the trigger guard and the receiver up with one longer screw. The factory screw is definitely not long enough, and that goes down in here. It's not long enough to go down all the way, so we'll just get a new screw for that. I think we can probably get matching screws for the front and back. So here is the Ruger American rifle. I like Ruger guns, but I do not like this stock. It's a one piece, has a trigger guard built in, and it didn't take much force to just snap this off on a cold day outside. I think he banged it against something or dropped it or something, and that snapped off. So obviously there's no factory replacement for this except to buy a whole new rifle stock. And apparently this 300 Blackout rifle, I can't find another stock, especially in this color. So what we're going to do is we're going to shave this off right here, nice and smooth, sand it, and we're going to reuse this hole by 3D printing something to fill that hole, and then get a longer bolt to run down the middle of the 3D print fill. We're also going to drill a hole on the back side of this for a rear screw. We're going to print this in black, by the way, because that's kind of a black and tan rifle, so we're going to make a black trigger guard instead of trying to match this color up. There is a cavity right behind this trigger. It's a square-shaped cavity down in the receiver, or right on in the frame here. So we're going to print a block, like 20 by 20 by 15 block, to go in here that'll hold a steel nut for the screw to go through here and tighten against. So it's going to be a two-part trigger guard, the guard, and a tensioning block for the rear. It should fit nicely right in this space here. We're going to print this in the 3D printer sideways, laying sideways, so that we have strength with these lines coming around. Because as this 3D printer prints each layer of this, you can see how this is going to be 100% infill. There's not going to be air or anything inside. It's going to be a solid piece. And these lines coming around here, the green and red ones, that's going to provide a lot of strength, so this thing doesn't snap off sideways. Now, if we had printed it, say, let's rotate this thing. Let's rotate this 90 degrees. And if we had tried to print it like that, I'm slicing it now so it'll produce the layers in the software. So it's finished now. Let's go through these layers and see if we had printed this with layers like this, all these thin little layers right through here would be at great risk of snapping off, just like the factory rifle did. So that's why we're printing this on its side. This little print project should take about an hour and a half, a little over, about an hour and 40 minutes to print. I'm using an Ender 3 Pro printer. It's got a little bit of an upgrade kit with the extruder here, a little bit better knobs and things like that, but this is basically a factory Ender 3 Pro using eSun PLA Plus filament. So after printing the first trial run, I noticed that my trigger guard I don't think is tall enough. I think I had set it at the 0 line of the base. So I'm going to raise that up and print that right here. Make that trigger guard a little taller. I think it'll fit better. To do that, I've got to raise these little cutouts here also, so that it cuts out that back of the trigger guard for the nut to go in smoothly. So let's print this and see how this turns out. This is the second run at the trigger guard printing now. I didn't mention it in the last section when I was on the computer, but there's something called a Z-axis seam. Whenever you print something, each layer that prints has to start somewhere. When you tell the printer to print it at a certain area, it'll go to that area to start that line. Now, this trigger guard originally, when I printed it the first time, was printed around backwards. and I had the Z-axis start point, or the Z-axis seam would start on the back. So basically that produced a bad little spot right here on the visible area of the trigger. So now I've told it to print the Z-axis seam on the back, and that's under the trigger guard where you won't ever see it. So the circular part of the trigger guard should print all in one smooth motion, not start there. So this should make a better print. I'll show you what that Z-axis seam looks like on a different part. This is a lacto fermentation lid that I printed, and as you can see, it has a Z-axis seam down the front here, but it was positioned in the printer facing backwards, so I told it to print back. So that's what we don't want on the nice pretty surface of the trigger guard, so that's why we switched that up and printed this again. What this lacto fermentation lid does is you obviously attach it to a jar like so, and you put your stuff you want to ferment. I'll be making some mead. This will ferment for a couple of weeks. Basically, it'll push the fermentation bubbles up through this, and this will be full of water, and it'll sit here and bubble, but not allow any air from the outside to get in to the jar. So now I've got this stock setting in a vise. Got just a cheap Hoppe's vise here. I'm gonna take a hacksaw and saw this off pretty close and then sand the rest smooth. Let's take this nice and easy. Don't get in too big of a hurry. I was able to figure out a way to hold the camera and just do this slowly. I got this one piece cut off. Start on the second one now. All right, now that I've got some painter's tape on here, I'm going to go ahead and sand this off without holding the camera so I don't make any mistakes. Now I've got this sanded off smooth. I'm going to take this tape off and use a file to level it and just make sure it's good and level. So we got that sanded in pretty good, and basically took a barbecue grill lighter to this surface just a little bit, give it a little heat to blend that in. Now that I've got the stock ready to mount this trigger guard, the printer is sitting here at about 84%. It shouldn't take too much longer to finish this up. So the trigger guard is mostly finished. I'm going to trim these little edges up, and I'm also going to angle this piece right here a little bit. I decided to go ahead and remove the material in here because it just need that extra bit of curve in the trigger right here. So just take this material out right here. It's not really needed with the rear and front bolts in here. That holds that very sturdily. After I cut that center piece out in here, I decided to go ahead and just make this look really nice instead of having to cut it out by hand, and also shorten the trigger guard just a little bit. So this is what the last version is going to look like. So I'll wrap up this video now. As you can see, you can repair a rifle. Just need to get that one bolt from the Ace Hardware, and they're closed on Sundays, so not going to be able to do that till tomorrow. But as you can see, turned out nice. Should be a lot stronger than the factory one, and if it does somehow get snapped off again, it takes about an hour to print a new one. I'll keep this file just in case.